Hello, I'm Peter Pizzolongo, Senior Director for Professional Development at the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And I'm joined today by Stephanie Feeney. Stephanie?
I'm really happy to be here in this conversation, Peter. Thank you for asking me. This gives me an opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, which is professional ethics in early childhood education. I was the co-author of the first NAEYC Code of Ethical Conduct, which was approved in 1989. I've written 2 books for NAEYC about professional ethics and quite a few articles over the years. I've participated in the development of 2 supplements for the NAEYC Code of Ethical Conduct, one for adult educators and one for program administrators. And I have been involved in 3 revisions of the code that have been conducted since 1989.
Wonderful, wonderful. So now you know why Stephanie is sitting here with me. The reason that we're doing this is for 2 things. One, this is the 20th anniversary of the code, so in honor of this anniversary, we are having this dialogue. And the other is that this dialogue is a supplement to an article by Stephanie in Young Children, Ethics in Early Care and Education, Where Do We Come From and Where Are We Going? So first I'd like to talk about what the code is to NAEYC, and the code is a position statement of NAEYC. And NAEYC develops and disseminates position statements for several reasons. One is to take informed decisions on significant issues in the field, issues that affect young children's development, to promote broad-based dialogue on these issues, and to promote this dialogue in a way that we can all speak with a common language, practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and families. And certainly the Code of Ethical Conduct does give us the opportunity to do that. Stephanie mentioned some of the history of the Code, and while this is the 20th anniversary of the Code, work on ethical issues in early childhood education preceded that. In the 1970s, we had the work of Lillian Katz and Evangeline Ward and others regarding ethical issues in working with young children. So Stephanie, can you tell us about that work and then what work followed that in which you were involved?
Well, Lillian and Evangeline wrote a wonderful and influential book called Ethical Behavior in Early Childhood Education, which was first published in 1978, and it was revised in 1991. I think it's still available. And Lillian really laid out a very powerful rationale for why it would be important for early childhood educators to have a code of ethical conduct. I served on the NAEYC governing board from 1980 to 1984. And at that time, people were interested in Lillian's book. So they had started saying, we need a code, somebody should write a code of ethics. And I thought that sounded like a good idea. I didn't know anything about it. I took all the files. I went home. I went, I don't know what I'm doing here. I didn't like philosophy in college. But I remembered a very interesting talk I had heard by a philosopher in my institution, the University of Hawaii. The philosopher's Professor Kenneth Kipnis. He's a specialist in professional ethics and a very interesting man. And I thought, well, I'll call him. And so I called Ken and I said, this National Association of Early Childhood Educators has asked me to look into writing a code. And he had a child in preschool. And he had an ethical dilemma with the preschool. So he was kind of interested. He said, well, I know some things about doing that. And I'll work with you. And so we began a collaboration that still continues. When I don't know what to do with a question now, I still call Ken. The first thing we did after he kind of signed on and said, well, I'll work with your organization, we put an article in Young Children in we have a list of those. It was about 84, 85. And it was a survey, and we said to our readership, is ethics an issue for you? Should we be pursuing the development of a code? And do you have any ethical issues? We also got a lot of ethical issues and dilemmas. And at one point, Ken was looking through these things, and he looked at me and he said, Stephanie, these people are in ethical pain. So we have difficult issues we're dealing with. So we got these issues, and we read them and we categorized them, And we did a couple things. We tried to figure out what are the categories that these issues fall into. How do they organize themselves? And it was really clear there were a lot of issues that had to do with children. There were more issues that had to do with families. We'll talk about one of those. There were issues that had to do with colleagues and employers, but sort of with other adults you work with. And then there were a whole set of things that were kind of other agencies' responsibility to community and society. So those became the categories, the 4 sections of the code. Then we looked at these issues that people sent us, and we said there's some that keep coming up. And so we took some of those issues and we wrote cases, which we will
And we're going to do some cases
do that
shortly.
today. And then we went to groups all over the country. We got a grant from the Wallace Alexander Gerbode Foundation. And we traveled around, mostly Hawaii and California, and we said, okay, here's the situation. What would the good early childhood educator do in this situation? And we started to get real consensus about the things we should do. The other thing that we did that was very interesting and very fun to do was to start to look at our core values, because a code of ethics is based on the core values of a profession. And so we said to people, what do we really believe in? What are our values? And that was wonderful because we had so much consensus. We didn't always agree on the words, but we knew what we believed in. And that's my favorite thing about this code, was identifying what are the things we care about as a group of people who work with young children. So
And then through that process, you were able to develop the first draft of the code.
we did.
And take that around the country. And that was part of the 5-year process in getting buy-in across the field.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
first we looked at
Yeah.
core values, we looked at cases, we looked at codes from other professional organizations, we talked to philosophers. We had a couple philosophy consultants who really made sure that what we were doing was consistent with the integrity of the philosophy of ethics. And then we drafted a code. And somewhere early in that process, NAEYC created an ethics commission that oversaw this work and that met regularly and advised those of us who were actually kind of doing the staff work on it. It wasn't staff work; we were volunteers. And so we had that group to guide us, and then we would write something up, and we'd take it out on the road. We'd take it to workshops. We'd put it in the journal. Eventually, we put drafts in the journal. We got comments. We put cases in the journal. So what we really loved about this process was that it was a participatory process. This is our code.
Right.
We didn't write it for anyone. We went to our members, to the people who care about kids, and we said, what would be the right thing for us to do in these situations? What would the morality of early childhood education look like, or the ethics?
So we've written the code with the field. The governing board approved that first code in 1989, and at that time the board stated that every 5 years the code would be reviewed by the board, and then it would be determined, do we need to update the code, do we need to reaffirm the code, or do we need to revise the code? So since 1989, the code has been reviewed and revised and reaffirmed. We have had new editions of the code in 1992, 1997, and then the most recent code revised in 2005. And then at each time, we followed the same process. We've gotten input from the field on what revisions they feel that we need to put into the code. We develop drafts. Now that we do have the internet, we put the code. It's easier, and we get it out to everybody much more quickly, but we still do the face-to-face, and I've been involved more recently in working with Stephanie and Nancy Freeman and other leaders in ethics in our field in getting input from the field. And so that's a process that we've continued.
I'd like to just make a comment about, because we were talking about core values.
Right.
And when we did the core values, they're right in the front of the code. When we did the core values in 1989, and we did the first 2 revisions, there was no changes. Everybody said, that's right. Those are the right values. In the 3rd edition, we added 1 core value. So in 2005, we added the value, respect diversity in children, families, and colleagues.